Good morning, everybody. I hope it's still morning on the East Coast. I think it is 11:10, 8:10 where I am in California. And let me turn that down a little bit. I think it's got some in there, some Chinese music in the background. I don't know if you can hear it. However, my name is Xianliang, and we are on Morsels of a Thought number 1227. I am currently reading Grass Soup on Sundays, Sunday series, Zhang Xianliang, and we were on 1960, the 12th of July, where he is we'll call him a prisoner because it was really a prison and it was to reform him. It was a prison reform camp during the 1960s and early 70s in mainland China. He was supposed to talk about the party, and he was able to stay sane by writing about his experience. However, he spent 10 years writing in code so that only a few words would come out and that there would be no indication of his not wanting to be completely with the Communist Party, the CCP, I think they call it, the Chinese Communist Party. So 11th of July, 1960, Capitol construction, hauled dirt clods. That's all he says. And we started this last week. He says, in the 1960s, many diaries of Mar made public in China. These would be filled with the lofty spirit, the progressive thinking of their authors, and they would be prescribed as required reading, study material by the leaders. On the surface, the author would seem to be a genuine individual, honestly setting down a record of his soul with only himself in mind. In fact, from the start, he would be writing a recitation for his readers. I did not want to become a martyr or a hero, but I also did not want to get into trouble as a result of this diary. Since I had decided to write it, it was imperative that I be prepared for the possibility that the diary might fall into someone else's hands. I had to think about how I might explain its entries, how I could safely be responsible for it. Consequently, the diary could be no more than a ledger. Later, the diary was indeed confiscated during a political movement known as the One Blow Three Counters movement. After scrutinizing it, the leaders of the state farm where I was then working failed to find any serious problems, and so the diary did not become incriminating evidence when they sentenced me. Both the diary and I were allowed to remain in existence. Today, this ledger-like quality has made my task much harder. Li Daoyuan of the Northern Wei dynasty is said to have spent many years. Okay, the Wei dynasty was in AD 386 to 534. All footnotes are the translators by the translator, initialed M.A. Both the diary and I were allowed to remain in existence. Today, this ledger-like quality has made my task much harder. Li Daoyuan of the Northern Wei dynasty is said to have spent many years verifying details before he completed his famous Notes on the Water classic. But excavating events in the memory is no easier than searching through ancient books. That period in my life is like a dream, hazy as mist. In order to make reality appear as it was then, not only do I have to divorce myself from the present, allowing my mind to be steeped in the past, but I have to experience once again the trauma of that past. Tormenting the mind and body in order to annotate a historical document is not something most scholarly writers experience. And yet I rejoice that I did not write this diary in more detail. If I had added just one more word in places, I would not be sitting here peacefully working today. Long ago, the diary would have become part of the file of a dead man, and as such it would have been destroyed. The notebook was confiscated in 1970, after which the inspectors began marking it up with queries. To this day, I don't know why they did not cross examine me. I indicate below where the marks were made, but the fact that they occurred in only two places shows how carefully this diary was written. In 1980, after I had been rehabilitated, the diary was presented to me together with other documents. The other documents, performance records, self examinations, statements by other people informing on me and accusing me, were all, as government regulations decreed, destroyed before my eyes. I begged that this diary be exempted and preserved. It has become the only connection I have now with that former world. Can it be that that precious springtime in my life, expended in hard labor, has nothing more to show for itself than this? The yellowing pages, the fading ink of the characters lead me back, one by one, to past events. They make it impossible for me to doubt that these events did indeed make up my life. I do not want to judge the past. I also do not want to use material that has only recently become available to enhance these notes. I want the diary to stand as an original manuscript telling people just how far the world can fall, and how, even at that debased material and spiritual level, people go on living. Good morning, Listeros Cantara. How are you doing? Good to see you. To go back to that first day, 11th of July, 1960, capital construction is what I have written for this date. In fact, just meant building a house. We had no idea why, when we were starving, when convicts were dying in groups at a time, we should be mobilized to build a house. July is a relatively idle time in the Northwest. The summer crops have been harvested and the autumn crops are already planted. In the past, farmers would use this time to recuperate. They would lay their weary bodies on the earth that sustained them in the shade of willows beside small brooks. Poets would look at this contentment and idealize it in verse, particularly when they themselves felt frustrated. Small farming villages have always seemed a lost paradise for Chinese. But when the policy of turning farms into communes began, farmers no longer had a single day of ease. Then, not one of the year's 365 days was a rest day for them, let alone for convicts in later labor, let alone for convicts in labor reform camps. Hard labor is considered the only way to reform a man's thinking. Like prescribed medicine, it can't be stopped for a single day. The weather this July was particularly fine. People went, people were starving, but the sun had not become any less robust because of that. She was as full and abundant as ever. I often think back to those pollutionless blue skies, those carefree, fluffy clouds. We seldom see such unsullied skies today. From the construction site where we were going to build this house, that is, from a raised bank of earth, you could see the paddy glisten below like black green satin. A hot breeze would come in, carrying with it the fragrance of the fields, making our feeble work song a little less exhausted. Feeble work song. Brothers, raise the earth rammer, pound it hard. Bastard if you don't pound hard. Give it to her fucking hard. Good weather and a good season could lessen the pain and hunger. By the way, the F word in Chinese translates as well to doing things. So um, the word gan means to work. So that's why they probably used that word. Good weather and a good season could lessen the pain and hunger. This too may have been a reason I started to write the diary at this time. Since the weather was so good, the propaganda bulletins that the leaders were issuing were especially hard to believe. Grain output has gone down to consecutive years. in consecutive years as a result of natural disasters. So we are instituting a policy of lowered rations to be substituted with gourds and greens. No matter how outrageous, no matter how, no matter how outrageous, how ludicrous this seemed, nobody dared to ask the leaders for an explanation. Everyone appeared to believe the statement implicitly. What energy remained in our bodies was put into hard physical labor in order to reform. Years later, I finally understood how the Chinese people altogether could sink into the hell of famine for those whole for 3 whole years. There's a footnote here. The generally accepted figure for the number of people who died of famine or famine related causes from 1960 to 1962 is 30 million. That's twice as much as I thought. The real reasons for what was happening in those 2 years The real reasons for what was happening were announced to us too late, but this was not an inconvenience to us. On the contrary, it allowed us the chance to appear surprised. It gave us the opportunity to arrange our recollection of those events as though they were a tragicomedy, a farce, rather than a disaster. Most of the labor reform convicts had been put through heat treatment in their original work units. Like alloyed steel, they had been imbued with qualities that made them well suited for doing labor reform. Many actually felt fortunate to be in a camp and away from the heat treatment, as though coming to do labor reform was a favorable change. Just as a blind man might feel grateful to fall off a single plank bridge and find himself in a shallow, dry ditch, the convicts felt quite relieved. Anything was better than being criticized and struggled against in the heat treatment. Now, I have a distant relative that eventually passed away in China because of this. They call it, well, anyway, that is a very bad time. Before, 1,000 league precipice had been yawning under their feet. Saved from that, why should they question China's leaders now? Like them falling into a shallow ditch. Whatever, we're given to eat, we'll eat, was their attitude. Even if the labor reform camp supplied no food at all, they were there by the grace of the leaders. And so, although the labor was performed without much enthusiasm, back in the barracks there was often laughter and high spirits. Um, you may have seen, if you've ever seen videos of or documentaries of China during that period, they would have people wearing dunce caps and kneeling and tied up with rope, and people touching them on the head insultingly. Touching somebody on the head is insulting sometimes, and they would really, really take landlords and have the tenants um, yell at them, and anybody who was in a position of power was now taken down, and the people that were at their minions would come and criticize them. So a lot of people died this way. A lot of people hated it. Of course they hated it. It was life threatening, and it killed a lot of people. This was during the Cultural Revolution in China. Back to the story. The weather was good. This work we had been assigned was also good. Building a house, strictly speaking, meant no more than mixing earth and water and gumming together earthen clods piled up into a wall. A few boards and a reed roof were then laid on top. A house was a square-shaped shelter that could keep out the wind and rain, not much more. Later, the phrase "learning from Da Qing" was promulgated, and this kind of house was given its own term in the dialect of the Northwest. It was called a gandale, or clod pile. Gandale, I don't know. Hauling dirt clods is a very simple kind of labor. The earthen clods we used for bricks were not really fired. We just dug them out of the ground with shovels, let them dry, and then used them. As a result, each was irregular. Instead of a brick, you could only call it a clod. Each clod weighed about 7 to 10 kilos. I could haul 3 of them at a time, at the most four. My whole body, including my belt, weighed no more than 44 kilos, so 3 or 4 clods weighed about the same as I did. I would carry this weight, not only the clods, but also my own weight, and walk with it for some 50 to 100 meters. The simplest things in life often cause the most trouble. This may be why leisure loving mankind has made work into a more and more complex thing. The irregular, multi sized clods would roll around on my back, digging into my spine at every step. When I say spine, I mean the actual bones, since there wasn't a scrap of extra flesh on my entire body. I could hear the scraping of the dry, hard clods against those bones. The sound was slightly sharp, giving it a derisive tone. Sometimes a sweetness would well up in my throat, but I never actually spat blood. The only visible blood was on my back, where the thin layer of skin had been scraped away. That didn't count since I couldn't see it. If you could manage to carry on, the skin quickly grew a protective layer of calluses. Our name for them was old silkworm cocoons, and if you couldn't carry on, you had to anyway. Pulling clods also had its easy side. This came when you walked down the road on the return. People who work at any heavy job will get a commensurate reward. For example, the road back was exactly as long as the road going. It was often hard to contain an appreciation for the fairness of the laws of nature. And what a road! It was a dry road, no water, no muck. Not only could bare feet slapping against the ground feel the warmth and dryness of the earth, they could also raise little puffs of fine dust. After I set a load down, I could enjoy the sensation of being free. The diary starts on the 11th of July, but I must describe the work in the paddy fields that I was doing before that, or the reader will not understand my sense of release. He will not know why hauling clods was such good work. Rice paddies are seeded in May, seeded. By July, the sprouts are already at the plucking stage, or the transplanting stage. Uh, I guess it's a British term. Before this, we would already have weeded them countless times. The people in Ningxia have a saying. Ningxia is in western China. Rice pull 9, starved dogs you'll find. This forced rhyme means that the more weeds and grasses you pull out of a rice field, the better the rice plants grow. And the more rice you grow, the less likely you'll starve. Fewer starving humans means fewer corpses for dogs to feed on. While you weed, you serve two functions: pulling up grass and at the same time stamping the field using your feet to crush down rotted plant matter so that it goes into the earth and fertilizes it. The relationship between weed pulling and starving dogs may be far fetched, but in order to follow this ancient bit of farm lore, we had to immerse ourselves in water from May till July. The rice fields of the labor camps were created out of virgin land. When you turned irrigation water onto such land, the weeds would leap forward, the weeds would leap upward for sheer joy. All kinds: shaw grass, ice grass, gao grass, even Gigi grass, which will normally grow only in arid regions. To convicts who had to weed these things out, all the myriad plants of the earth seemed to have gathered at our feet rather than immortals' palms, which do only grow on the desert. A pair of hands were all that was required. We weeded no differently from the time our ancestors first entered the agricultural stage of society thousands of years ago. That's capitalized, agricultural stage of society. We would bend our backs and pull from before sunrise to the time the moon came up. If it was a particularly bright moonlit night and it was still possible to distinguish rice shoots from weeds, then we would just keep on pulling. Sometimes, however, the convicts would be weeding a field, and when they looked back, it wouldn't see any rice. A vast sheet of black water would be all that was left. The troop leader would then have hard work to do. He would have to run up and down the banks of the field, looking through the weeds to see if there were any rice stalks in them. View- Were were the convicts intentionally sabotaging production, pulling up rice shoots along with the weeds? Usually his efforts would be in vain. The young shoots would long ago have been murdered by the healthy weeds. After more than 700 days of wielding a shovel and hoe, my soles and palms had passed through the bloody stage and grown a protective layer of calluses. Legs cannot accustom themselves to constant immersion, however, certainly not in that water. Dense with rotted vegetable matter, salts, and minerals, it was more of a kind of supersaturated solution. The people of Ningxia described it accurately as mud soup. Every time you stamped your foot, a stinking smell would erupt from the black mud that it disturbed. Such nasty smells were insignificant, but the mud soup held substances that burned and stung your skin. After half a day, your legs would be covered with a layer of red welts. A layer is the only term I can use for it because you couldn't possibly count the sores individually. From the waterline downward, the leg would be a dense confusion of blisters. Very descriptively, Ningxia people called these crazy itching bumps. As soon as the bumps came out on your legs, they would start to itch, and this was not a normal sort of itching. It was an itch that worked its way into the soul, an itch that drove men to madness. Some convicts would hold one leg and jump around on the other while they howled as though they had been severely burned. If you tried to scratch the bumps with your fingernails, you would find you were scratching through thick boots. Another descriptive phrase used to mean that something has no effect. Scratching would not stop the itching in the slightest. The best thing might have been to rub the legs with sandpaper, but where were you going to find the sandpaper in a labor camp? An alternative was to use a dry, hardened old towel and rub like crazy. Needless to say, legs are made of skin and flesh. They are not like metal rods. Once you had scratched for a while, you would scrape through the skin. At that point, the itching would be replaced by pain, but this was much easier to bear. I later read a definition of the concept of itching. Itching can be considered a very slight form of pain. The author of this dictionary clearly never seriously itched in his life. The medical name for crazy itching bumps was rice paddy inflammation. Though it was a simple common form of skin infection, there was no simple common medicine with which to treat it. In order to make it possible for us to keep on working, pulling weeds in the rice fields, we were issued machine oil, the kind used to lubricate tractor engines. We were told to spread this on our legs as a preventative, at least as a layer of something between skin and water. Machine oil is adhesive. It stops up the pores of the skin and becomes inconvenient when you want to sleep at night. But the worst thing was that the machine oil was not effective. In the water, it was not necessarily any better, and out of the water, it was definitely unsatisfactory. So the question was, should one paint on machine oil or not? Should one imprison the two legs for 24 hours a day or simply itch? Each course of action had its persuasive arguments. This was the sort of quandary that drove the convicts crazy. The best solution was to get out of the water, to get out of the mud soup. We would bind a thick wad of weeds with other weeds and then toss the bundle up onto the nearby bank. And every time we did this, we glimpsed that oh so desirable dry land. We were like sailors out at sea for days, finally catching sight of land on the horizon. It was so close to us and yet so remote. We never knew when we would be allowed to dock to enjoy the land's dryness. 8 more lines. Today, July 11th, had finally come to shore. The diary starts this day, although I may already have worked on land for several days. Like a sailor who has finally reached his destination, it was only possible to think of writing in this new frame of mind. The fact that I had come back to dry land was probably the main reason that I started the diary on this day. So, it's page 16, and we will see you tomorrow for uh, Morsels of a Thought number 1228. I'll see you then. Okay? Old Kinderhack.